The horror genre has existed in some form since the earliest known periods of gaming. Since being popularized to the massive extent that they have, almost everyone is familiar with Silent Hill or Resident Evil in 2024. For this video, we are going back to a time where horror games were still in their infancy, where experimentation and creativity could coexist with the conventional, and where no one really knew the effect that such a game could have all these years later. Of course, we are talking about LSD Dream Emulator, the scariest non-horror game ever made. Being one of the first of its kind, LSD Dream Emulator falls into the category of a walking sim because that's all you do in this game is walk. Evidently, in 1998, no one knew that this genre would later become the catalyst for some of the best horror games and story-based games ever written, and its influence is easily perceptible immediately upon playing it. Basically, you've just taken some LSD and you wander around town for the better part of a year as you experience what the game has to offer. It's about as blunt a game could possibly be, and it's impossible to be disappointed. These dreams can vary from everyday, more pedestrian encounters, apparent from the subdued episodes when we're just walking around the house in the morning, for example, from desolate landscapes and the more hallucinogenic episodes. But occasionally, you'll witness things that I can only describe as absolutely terrifying, so I bring my focus to one sequence that drove me to stop playing the game and the sole reason for why I made this video in the first place. Before we begin, many of the game's more eerie interactions are elevated immensely by the sound design and world layout. The contrast between what is real and what isn't can establish a divide while we're playing. The feeling of teleporting from an obvious drug-induced maniacal episode to a presumed street corner is both confusing and unexpected. I think most people can relate when I say that the most disturbing nightmares a person can have are those that seem real, those that include everyday life and family. In this case, we have warped from our safe space to an unassuming road. It seems normal at first and far removed from every other location in the game up until this point. There is no music, the abundance of skyscrapers more than illuminate the adjacent streets. Some are malformed, resembling an AI rendition, or a dream of course. The sound of our own footsteps are more prominent than ever, that's until we hear this. You start to get the feeling that someone is watching you in a manner more effective than any horror game ever made. We turn our heads in all directions, but there's nothing. The sound turns on and off at random. Regardless, it seems to keep getting louder. By heading right long enough, you'll make out a woman in the distance. This is probably the first person you'll ever come across. Maybe she knows how to get out of here. Let's go and say hello. This is one of the many things in LSD Dream Emulator that has left a long-lasting effect on the horror genre all these years later. Although there's more examples, this woman's head falling off then proceeding to walk towards the camera is what got to me the most when first playing the game. The area after this one doesn't help either. For the most part, your mode of transportation would be bumping into objects. These act as portals to the game's expansive library of levels. Across 365 days, there's many points of interest around town, including famous monuments, buildings, objects, and sometimes animals, all of which lead down different rabbit holes respectively. Another element that I love are the poems, referred to as text dreams in-game. These show up every few days, depending on previous discoveries and interactions in the dream world. adding another element to the horror and the contrast as mentioned earlier. These remind me of the small cues in RE0, unique to each of its areas, however, they aren't quite as lyrical as these. Unironically, these segments are my favourite part about the game, acting as LSD emulators, only sane respite amidst this overtly feverish bombshell of a game. My personal favourites are Alarm Clock Ringing, Forest, and perhaps the best short story ever written, I Failed to Make Soba Noodles. Some of them are also very disturbing and graphic, to the extent where I cannot show it here, but I love each and every one of these still. I believe the music is what makes the game as scary as it is. Some of these tracks range from beautiful, peaceful, suiting the areas where they're used, because where this game is terrifying, it can also be one of the most tranquilizing games you can ever play. The demo is more jazzy and upbeat, playing into the stereotype, if there is such a thing, for a game all about hallucinogenic drugs. The soundtrack in general is another level, and way ahead of its time for 1998. It should be up there with the best soundtracks in gaming. They've seemed to use collective sounds and stock effects to create most of these. Random noises and random intervals, repetition. Just like this game, some of these can barely be considered music, and it's perfectly implemented throughout for a more unnatural experience. Evidently, the sound effects are supposed to drown out the music for the most part, letting it sink into your subconscious while you focus on the imagery and the loud sound effects created by the world itself. I don't even know what to say about this game sometimes. This imagery is something that you could only come up with while on drugs. I was able to get more than enough footage just by playing it for an hour or so. Just by minding your own business. A car can come out of nowhere and crash into the river. You'll come across headless women, sumo wrestlers, lions, mythological animals, whatever on earth this is. This could have inspired the baby in RE8 now that I think about it. The legendary Cube world, and the list goes on forever, really. Overall, I think LSD Dream Emulator is the type of game that will remain a core piece of gaming history for a very long time, and I will never forget my experience with it. This game will take you to the brink of mental collapse, through some of the most disturbing, weird, and otherwise outlandish adventures of all time, or it could take you to the most special of places, where there isn't a worry in the world, and you can just gaze into the sky and forget about things for a moment or two. Also, don't do drugs, it's cringe.